Chapter 7. The Hill of the Strange Trenches. There is no denying it was a beast of a day. Overhead was a sunless sky, muffled in clouds that were heavy with snow. Underfoot, a black frost. Blowing over it, a wind that felt as if it would take your skin off. When they got down into the plain, they found that this part of the ancient road was much more ruinous than any they had yet seen. They had to pick their way over great broken stones and between boulders and across rubble, hard going for sore feet. And however tired they got, it was far too cold for a halt. At about 10 o'clock, the first tiny snowflakes came loitering down and settled on Jill's arm. 10 minutes later, they were falling quite thickly. In 20 minutes, the ground was noticeably white. And by the end of half an hour, a good steady snowstorm, which looked as if it meant to last all day, was driving in their faces so that they could hardly see. In order to understand what followed, you must keep on remembering how little they could see. As they drew near the low hill which separated them from the place where the lighted windows had appeared, they had no general view of it at all. It was a question of seeing the next few paces ahead, and even for that you had to screw up your eyes. Needless to say, they were not talking. When they reached the foot of the hill, they caught a glimpse of what might be rocks on each side, squarish rocks if you looked at them carefully, but no one did. All were more concerned with the ledge right in front of them, which barred their way. It was about 4 feet high. The marsh-wiggle with his long legs had no difficulty in jumping onto the top of it, and then he helped the others up. It was a nasty, wet business for them, though not for him, because the snow now lay quite deep on the ledge. Then they had a stiff climb. Jill fell once, up very rough ground for about 100 yards, and came to a second ledge. There were 4 of these ledges altogether at quite irregular intervals. As they struggled onto the 4th ledge, there was no mistaking the fact that they were now at the top of the flat hill. Up till now, the slope had given them some shelter. Here they got the full fury of the wind, for the hill, oddly enough, was quite as flat on top as it had looked from a distance, a great level tableland which the storm tore across without resistance. In most places the snow was still hardly lying at all, for the wind kept catching it up off the ground in sheets and clouds and hurling it in their faces. And round their feet little eddies of snow ran about as you sometimes see them doing over ice. And indeed, in many places the surface was almost as smooth as ice. But to make matters worse, it was crossed and crisscrossed with curious banks or dikes, which sometimes divided it up into squares and oblongs. All these, of course, had to be climbed. They varied from 2 to 5 feet in height and were about a couple of yards thick. On the north side of each bank, the snow already lay in deep drifts, and after each climb you came down into the drift and got wet. Fighting her way forward with hood up and head down and numb hands inside her cloak, Jill had glimpses of other odd things on that horrible tableland. Things on her right that looked vaguely like factory chimneys, and on her left a huge cliff, straighter than any cliff ought to be. But she wasn't at all interested and didn't give them a thought. The only things she thought about were her cold hands and nose and chin and ears, and hot baths and beds at Harfang. Suddenly she slid about 5 feet, and found herself, to her horror, sliding down into a dark, narrow chasm which seemed that moment to have appeared in front of her. Half a second later she had reached the bottom. She appeared to be in a kind of trench or groove, only about 3 feet wide. And though she was shaken by the fall, almost the first thing she noticed was the relief of being out of the wind, for the walls of the trench rose high above her. The next thing she noticed was, naturally, the anxious faces of Scrub and Puddleglum looking down at her from the edge. "Are you hurt, Pole?" shouted Scrub. "Both legs broken, I shouldn't wonder," shouted Puddleglum. Jill stood up and explained that she was all right, but they'd have to help her out. "What is it you've fallen into?" asked Scrub. "It's a kind of trench, or it might be a kind of sunken lane or something," said Jill. "It runs quite straight." "Yes, by Jove," said Scrub, "and it runs due north. I wonder, is it a sort of road? If it was, we'd be out of this infernal wind down there. Is there a lot of snow at the bottom?" "Hardly any. It all blows over the top, I suppose." "What happens farther on?" "Half a sec, I'll go and see," said Jill. She got up and walked along the trench, but before she had gone far, turned sharply to the right. She shouted this information back to the others. "What's round the corner?" asked Scrub. Now, it happened that Jill had the same feeling about twisty passages and dark places underground, or even nearly underground, that Scrub had about the edges of cliffs. She had no intention of going around that corner alone, especially when she heard Puddleglum bawling out from behind her, "Be careful, Pole. It's just the sort of place that might lead to a dragon's cave, and in a giant country there might be giant earthworms or giant beetles." "I don't think it goes anywhere much," said Jill, coming hastily back. "I'm jolly well gonna have a look," said Scrub. "What do you mean by anywhere much, I should like to know?" So he sat down on the edge of the trench — everyone was too wet by now to bother about being a bit wetter — and then dropped in. He pushed past Jill, and though he didn't say anything, she felt sure that he knew she had funked it. So she followed him close, but took care not to get in front of him. It proved, however, to be a disappointing exploration. They went round the right-hand turn and straight on for a few paces. Here there was a choice of ways: straight on again or sharp to the right. "That's no good," said Scrub, glancing down the right-hand turn. "That would be taking us back, south." He went straight on, but once more in a few steps they found a second turn to the right. But this time there was no choice of ways, for the trench they had been following here came to a dead end. "No good," grunted Scrub. Jill lost no time in turning and leading the way back. When they returned to the place where Jill had first fallen in, the Marshwiggle with his long arms had no difficulty in pulling them out. But it was dreadful to be out on top again. Down in those narrow slits of trenches, their ears had almost begun to thaw. They had been able to see clearly and breathe easily and hear each other speak without shouting. It was absolute misery to come back into the withering coldness, and it did seem hard when Puddleglum chose that moment for saying, "Are you still sure of those signs, Pole? What's the one we ought to be after now?" "Oh, come on, bother the signs," said Pole. "Something about someone mentioning Aslan's name, I think, but I'm jolly well not going to give a recitation here." As you can see, she had got the order wrong. That was because she had given up saying the signs out over every night. But she still really knew them if she troubled to think. But she was no longer so pat in her lesson as to be sure of reeling them off in the right order at a moment's notice and without thinking. Puddleglum's question annoyed her, because deep down inside her she was already annoyed with herself for not knowing the lion's lesson quite so well, and she felt she ought to have known it. This annoyance, added to the misery of being very cold and tired, made her say, "Bother the signs," and she didn't perhaps quite mean it. "Oh, that's what's next, was it?" said Puddleglum. "Now I wonder, are you right? Got 'em mixed, I shouldn't wonder. Seems to me this hill, this flat place we're on, is worth stopping to have a look at. Have you noticed—" "Oh, Lor," said Scrub, "is this a time for stopping to admire the view? For goodness sake, let's get on." "Oh, look, look, look," cried Jill, and pointed. Everyone turned, and everyone saw. Some way off to the north, and a good deal higher up than the tableland on which they stood, a line of lights had appeared. This time even more obviously than when the travelers had seen them the night before. They were windows, smaller windows that made one think deliciously of bedrooms, and larger windows that made one think of great halls with fires roaring on the hearth and hot soup or juicy sirloin smoking on the table. "Harfang!" exclaimed Scrub. "That's all very well," said Puddleglum, "but what I was saying was—" "Oh, shut up," said Jill crossly. "We haven't a moment to lose. Don't you remember what the lady said about their locking up so early? We must get there in time. We must. We'll die if we're shut out on a night like this." "Well, it isn't exactly a night, not yet," began Puddleglum, but the two children both said, "Come on," and began stumbling forward on the slippery tableland as quickly as their legs would carry them. The Marshwiggle followed them, still talking, but now that they were forcing their way into the wind again, they could not have heard him even if they had wanted to, and they didn't want. They were thinking of baths and beds and hot drinks, and the idea of coming to Harfang too late and being shut out was almost unbearable. In spite of their haste, it took them a long time to cross the flat top of that hill, and even when they had crossed it, there were still several ledges to climb down on the far side. But at last they reached the bottom and could see what Harfang was like. It stood on a high crag, and in spite of its many towers, was more of a huge house than a castle. Obviously the gentle giants feared no attack. There were windows on the outside wall quite close to the ground, a thing no one would have in a serious fortress. There were even odd little doors here and there, so that it would be quite easy to get in and out of the castle without going through the courtyard. This raised the spirits of Jill and Scrub. It made the whole place look more friendly and less forbidding. At first, the height and steepness of the crag frightened them, but presently they noticed that there was an easier way up on the left and that the road wound up toward it. It was a terrible climb after the journey they had already had, and Jill nearly gave up. Scrub and Puddleglum had to help her for the last 100 yards, but in the end they stood before the castle gate. The portcullis was up and the gate was open. However tired you are, it takes some nerve to walk up to a giant's front door. In spite of all his previous warnings against Harfang, it was Puddleglum who showed the most courage. "Steady pace now," he said. "Don't look frightened, whatever you do. We've done the silliest thing in the world by coming at all, but now that we are here, we'd best put a bold face on it." With these words, he strode forward into the gateway, stood under the arch where the echo would help his voice, and called out as loud as he could, "Ho, porter, guests who seek lodging!" And while he was waiting for something to happen, he took off his hat and knocked off the heavy mass of snow which had gathered on its wide brim. "I say," whispered Scrub to Jill, "he may be a wet blanket, but he has plenty of pluck and cheek." A door opened, letting out a delicious glow of firelight, and the porter appeared. Jill bit her lips for fear she should scream. He was not a perfectly enormous giant, that is to say, he was rather taller than an apple tree, but nothing like so tall as a telegraph pole. He had bristly red hair, a leather jerkin with metal plates fastened all over so as to make a kind of male shirt, bare knees, very hairy indeed, and things like puttees on his legs. He stooped down and goggled at Puddleglum. "What sort of creature do you call yourself?" he said. Jill took her courage in both hands. "Please," she said, shouting up to the giant, "the lady of the green kirtle salutes the king of the gentle giants, and has sent us 2 southern children and this marsh-wiggle," his name's Puddleglum, "to your autumn feast, if it's quite convenient, of course," she added. "Oh ho," said the porter, "that's quite a different story. Come in, little people, come in. You'd best come into the lodge while I'm sending word to His Majesty." He looked at the children with curiosity. "Blue faces," he said. "I didn't know they were that color. Don't care about it myself, but I dare say you look quite nice to one another. Beetles fancy other beetles, they do say." "Our faces are only blue with cold," said Jill. "We're not this color really." "Then come in and get warm. Come in, little shrimps," said the porter. They followed him into the lodge, and though it was rather terrible to hear such a big door clang shut behind them, they forgot about it as soon as they saw the thing they had been longing for ever since supper time last night, a fire. And such a fire! It looked as if 4 or 5 whole trees were blazing on it, and it was so hot they couldn't go within yards of it. But they all flopped down on the brick floor as near as they could bear the heat, and heaved great sighs of relief. "Now, youngster," said the porter to another giant who'd been sitting in the back of the room staring at the visitors till it looked as if his eyes would start out of his head, "run across with this message to the house." And he repeated what Jill had said to him. The younger giant, after a final stare and a great guffaw, left the room. "Now, Froggy," said the porter to Puddleglum, "you look as if you wanted some cheering up." He produced a black bottle very like Puddleglum's own, but about 20 times larger. Let me see," said the porter. "I can't give you a cup or you'll drown yourself. Let me see. This salt cellar will be just a thing. You needn't mention it all over the house. The silver will keep on getting over here, and it's not my fault." The salt cellar was not very like one of ours, being narrower and more upright, and made quite a good cup for Puddleglum when the giant set it down on the floor beside him. The children expected Puddleglum to refuse it, distrusting gentle giants as he did. But he muttered, "It's rather late to be thinking of precautions now that we're inside and the door shut behind us." Then he sniffed at the liquor. "Smells all right," he said, "but that's nothing to go by. Better make sure." And he took a sip. "Tastes all right, too," he said, "but it might do that at the first sip. How does it go on?" And he took a larger sip. "Ah," he said, "but is it the same all the way down?" And he took another. "There'll be something nasty at the bottom, I shouldn't wonder," he said, and finished the drink. He licked his lips and remarked to the children, "This'll be a test, you see. If I curl up or burst or turn into a lizard or something, then you'll know not to take anything they offer you." But the giant, who was too far up to hear the things Puddleglum had been saying under his breath, roared with laughter and said, "Why, Froggy, you're a man. See him put it away." "Not a man, Marshwiggle," replied Puddleglum in a somewhat indistinct voice. "Not Frog either, Marshwiggle." At that moment the door opened behind them, and the younger giant came in saying, "They are to go to the throne room at once." The children stood up, but Puddleglum remained sitting and said, "Marshwiggle, Marshwiggle, very respectable Marshwiggle, respect-a-wiggle." "Show them the way, young'un," said the giant porter. "You better carry Froggy. He's had a drop more than's good for him." "Nothing wrong with me," said Puddleglum. "Not a frog. Nothing frog with me. I'm a respect-a-biggle." But the young giant caught him up by the waist and signed to the children to follow. In this undignified way they crossed the courtyard. Puddleglum, held in the giant's fist and vaguely kicking the air, did certainly look very like a frog. But they had little time to notice this, for they soon entered the great doorway of the main castle, both their hearts beating faster than usual, and after pattering along several corridors at a trot, to keep up with the giant's paces, found themselves blinking in the light of an enormous room where lamps glowed and fire roared on the hearth, and both were reflected from the gilding of roof and cornice. More giants than they could count stood on their right and left, all in magnificent robes, and on 2 thrones at the far end sat 2 huge shapes that appeared to be the king and queen. About 20 feet from the thrones they stopped. Scrub and Jill made an awkward attempt at a bow. Girls are not taught how to curtsy at Experiment House. And the young giant carefully put Puddleglum down on the floor, where he collapsed into a sort of sitting position. With his long limbs, he looked, to tell the truth, uncommonly like a large spider. Chapter 8. The House of Harfang. "Go on, Pole, do your stuff," whispered Scrub. Jill found that her mouth was so dry that she couldn't speak a word. She nodded savagely at Scrub. Thinking to himself that he would never forgive her, or Puddleglum either, Scrub licked his lips and shouted up to the king giant, "If you please, sire, the lady of the green kirtle salutes you by us and said you'd like to have us for your autumn feast." The giant king and queen looked at each other, nodded to each other, and smiled in a way that Jill didn't exactly like. She liked the king better than the queen. He had a fine curled beard and a straight eagle-like nose, and was really rather good-looking as giants go. The queen was dreadfully fat and had a double chin and a fat powdered face, which isn't a very nice thing at the best of times, and of course looks much worse when it is 10 times too big. Then the king put out his tongue and licked his lips. Anyone might do that, but his tongue was so very large and red and came out so unexpectedly that it gave Jill quite a shock. "Oh, what good children," said the queen. Perhaps she's the nice one after all, thought Jill. "Yes, indeed," said the king. "Quite excellent children. We welcome you to our court. Give me your hands." He stretched down his great right hand, very clean and with any number of rings on the fingers, but also with terrible pointed nails. He was much too big to shake hands with, which the children in turn held up to him, but he shook the arms. "And what's that?" asked the king, pointing to Puddleglum. "Respectable," said Puddleglum. "Oh!" screamed the queen, gathering her skirts close about her ankles. "The horrid thing! It's alive!" "He's quite all right, your majesty, really, he is," said Scrub hastily. "You'll like him much better when you get to know him. I'm sure you will." I hope you won't lose all interest in Jill for the rest of the book if I tell you that at this moment she began to cry. There was a good deal of excuse for her. Her feet and hands and ears and nose were still only just beginning to thaw. Melted snow was trickling off her clothes. She had hardly anything to eat or drink all that day, and her legs were aching so that she felt she could not go on standing much longer. Anyway, it did more good at that moment than anything else would have done, for the queen said, "Oh, the poor child! My lord, we do wrong to keep our guests standing. Quick, some of you, take them away. Give them food and wine and baths. Comfort the little girl. Give her lollipops. Give her dolls. Give her physics. Give her all you can think of. Possets and comfits and caraways and lullabies and toys. Don't cry, little girl, or you won't be good for anything when the feast comes." Jill was just as indignant as you and I would have been at the mention of toys and dolls, and though lollipops and comfits might be all very well in their way, she very much hoped that something more solid would be provided. The queen's foolish speech, however, produced excellent results, for Puddleglum and Scrub were at once picked up by gigantic gentlemen-in-waiting, and Jill by a gigantic maid of honor, and carried off to their rooms. Jill's room was about the size of a church, and would have been rather grim if it had not had a roaring fire on the hearth and a very thick crimson carpet on the floor. And here delightful things began to happen to her. She was handed over to the queen's old nurse, who was, from the giant's point of view, a little old woman almost bent double with age, and from the human point of view, a giantess small enough to go about an ordinary room without knocking her head on the ceiling. She was very capable, though Jill did wish she wouldn't keep on clicking her tongue and saying things like, "Oh, la la, up's a daisy, and there's a duck, and now we'll be all right, my poppet." She filled a giant foot bath with hot water and helped Jill into it. If you can swim, as Jill could, a giant bath is a lovely thing. And giant towels, though a bit rough and coarse, are lovely too, because there are acres of them. In fact, you don't need to dry at all. You just roll about on them in front of the fire and enjoy yourself. And when that was over, clean, fresh, warmed clothes were put on Jill. Very splendid clothes, and a little too big for her, but clearly made for humans, not giantesses. I suppose if that woman in the green kirtle comes by here, they must be used to guests of our size, thought Jill. She soon saw that she was right about this, for a table and chair of the right height for an ordinary grown-up human were placed for her, and the knives and forks and spoons were the proper size, too. It was delightful to sit down, feeling warm and clean at last. Her feet were still bare, and it was lovely to tread on the giant carpet. She sank in it well over her ankles, and it was just the thing for sore feet. The meal, which I suppose we must call dinner, though it was nearer tea time, was cock-a-leekie soup and hot roast turkey and steamed pudding and roast chestnuts and as much fruit as you could eat. The only annoying thing was that the nurse kept coming in and out, and every time she came in she brought a gigantic toy with her, a huge doll bigger than Jill herself, a wooden horse on wheels about the size of an elephant, a drum that looked like a young gasometer, and a woolly lamb. They were crude, badly made things, painted in very bright colors, and Jill hated the sight of them. She kept on telling the nurse she didn't want them, but the nurse said, "Tut, tut, 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 you'll want 'em all right when you've had a bit of a rest, I know, tee-hee-hee. Beddy bye now, a precious poppet." The bed was not a giant bed, but only a big four-poster, like what you might see in an old-fashioned hotel, and very small it looked in that enormous room, but she was very glad to tumble into it. "Is it still snowing, nurse?" she asked sleepily. "No, raining now, ducky," said the giantess. "Rain will wash away all the nasty snow. Precious Poppet will be able to go out and play tomorrow." And she tucked Jill up and said good night. I know nothing so disagreeable as being kissed by a giantess. Jill thought the same, but was asleep in 5 minutes. The rain fell steadily all that evening and all the night, dashing against the windows of the castle, and Jill never heard it, but slept deeply, past supper time and past midnight. And then came the deadest hour of the night, and nothing stirred but the mice in the house of the giants. At that hour there came to Jill a dream. It seemed to her that she awoke in the same room and saw the fire sunk low in red, and in the firelight the great wooden horse. And the horse came of its own will, rolling on its wheels across the carpet, and stood at her head. But now it was no longer a horse, but a lion as big as the horse. And then it was not a toy lion, but a real lion, the real lion, just as she had seen him on the mountain beyond the world's end. And a smell of all sweet-smelling things there filled the room. But there was some trouble in Jill's mind, though she could not think what it was, and the tears streamed down her face and wet the pillow. The lion told her to repeat the signs, and she found that she had forgotten them all. At that a great horror came over her, and Aslan took her up in his jaws. She could feel his lips and his breath, but not his teeth, and carried her to the window and made her look out. The moon shone bright, and written in great letters across the world, or the sky, she did not know which, were the words, "Under me." After that the dream faded away, and when she woke, very late next morning, she did not remember that she had dreamed at all. She was up and dressed and had finished breakfast in front of the fire when the nurse opened the door and said, "Here's Pretty Poppet's little friends come to play with her." In came Scrub and the Marshwiggle. "Hello, good morning," said Jill. "Isn't this fun? I've slept about 15 hours, I believe. I do feel better, don't you?" "I do," said Scrub, "but Puddleglum says he has a headache. Hello, your window has a window seat. If we got up on that, we could see out." And at once they all did so, and at the first glance Jill said, "Oh, how perfectly dreadful!" The sun was shining, and except for a few drifts, the snow had become almost completely washed away by the rain. Down below them, spread out like a map, lay the flat hilltop which they had struggled over yesterday afternoon. Seen from the castle, it could not be mistaken for anything but the ruins of a gigantic city. It had been flat, as Jill now saw, because it was still, on the whole, paved, though in places the pavement was broken. The criss-cross banks were what was left of the walls of huge buildings which might once have been giants' palaces and temples. One bit of wall, about 500 feet high, was still standing. It was that which she had thought was a cliff. The things that looked like factory chimneys were enormous pillars, broken off at unequal heights. Their fragments lay at their bases like felled trees of monstrous stone. The ledges which they had climbed down on the north side of the hill, and also no doubt the other ledges which they had climbed up on the south side, were the remaining steps of giant stairs. To crown all, in large dark lettering across the center of the pavement ran the words, "Under me." The three travelers looked at each other in dismay, and after a short whistle Scrub said what they were all thinking, "The second and third signs muffed." And at that moment Jill's dream rushed back into her mind. "It's my fault," she said in despairing tones. I've given up repeating the signs every night. If I'd been thinking about them, I could have seen it was the city, even in all that snow." "I'm worse," said Puddleglum. "I did see, or nearly. I thought it looked uncommonly like a ruined city." "You're the only one who isn't to blame," said Scrub. "You did try to make us stop." Didn't try hard enough, though, said the Marshwiggle, and I'd no call to be trying. I ought to have done it, as if I couldn't have stopped you two with one hand each. The truth is, said Scrub, we were so jolly keen on getting to this place that we weren't bothering about anything else. At least I know I was. Ever since we met the woman with the knight who didn't talk, we've been thinking about nothing else. We'd nearly forgotten about Prince Rilian. I shouldn't wonder, said Puddleglum, if that wasn't exactly what she intended. What I don't understand, said Jill, is how we didn't see the lettering. Or could it have come there since last night? Could he, Aslan, have put it there in the night? I had such a queer dream. And then she told them all about it. Why, you chump, said Scrub. We did see it. We got into the lettering, don't you see? We got into the letter E in me. That was your sunk lane. We walked along the bottom stroke of the E, due north, turned to our right along the upright, came to another turn to the right, that's the middle stroke, and then we went on to the top left-hand corner, or if you like, the northeastern corner of the letter, and came back. Like the bally idiots that we are. He kicked the window seat savagely and went on. So it's no good, Pole. I know what you were thinking, because I was thinking the same. You were thinking how nice it would have been if Aslan hadn't put the instructions on the stones of the ruined city till after we'd passed it. And then it would have been his fault, not ours. So likely, isn't it? No, we must just own up. We've only 4 signs to go by, and we've muffed the first 3. You mean I have, said Jill. It's quite true. I've spoiled everything ever since you brought me here. All the same, I'm frightfully sorry and all that. All the same, what are the instructions? Under me? Doesn't seem to make much sense. Yes, it does, though, said Puddleglum. It means we've got to look for the prince under the city. But how can we? Asked Jill. That's the question, said Puddleglum, rubbing his big frog-like hands together. How can we now? No doubt if we'd had our minds on our job when we were at the ruinous city, we'd have been shown how. Found a little door, or a cave, or a tunnel, met someone to help us. Might have been, you never know, Aslan himself. We'd have got down under those paving stones somehow or other. Aslan's instructions always work. There are no exceptions. But how to do it now, that's another matter. Well, we shall just have to go back, I suppose, said Jill. Easy, isn't it, said Puddleglum. We might try opening that door to begin with. And they all looked at the door and saw that none of them could reach the handle and that almost certainly no one could turn it if they did. Do you think they won't let us out if we ask, said Jill. And nobody said, but everyone thought, supposing they don't. It was not a pleasant idea. Puddleglum was dead against any idea of telling the giants their real business and simply asking to be let out, and of course the children couldn't tell without his permission because they had promised. And all 3 felt pretty sure that there would be no chance of escaping from the castle by night. Once they were in their rooms with the doors shut, they would be prisoners till morning. They might, of course, ask to have their doors left open, but that would rouse suspicions. Our only chance, said Scrub, is to try to sneak away by daylight. Mightn't there be an hour in the afternoon when most of the giants are asleep? And if we could steal down into the kitchen, mightn't there be a back door open? It's hardly what I call a chance, said the Marshwiggle, but it's all the chance we're likely to get. As a matter of fact, Scrub's plan was not quite so hopeless as you might think. If you want to get out of a house without being seen, the middle of the afternoon is in some ways a better time to try it than in the middle of the night. Doors and windows are more likely to be open, and if you are caught, you can always pretend you weren't meaning to go far and had no particular plans. It's very hard to make either giants or grown-ups believe this if you're found climbing out of a bedroom window at 1 o'clock in the morning. We must put them off their guard, though, said Scrub. We must pretend we love being here and are longing for this autumn feast. That's tomorrow night, said Puddleglum. I heard one of them say so. I see, said Jill. We must pretend to be awfully excited about it and keep on asking questions. They think we're absolute infants anyway, which will make it easier. Gay, said Puddleglum with a deep sigh. That's what we've got to be. Gay. As if we haven't a care in the world. Frolicsome. You 2 youngsters haven't always got very high spirits, I've noticed. You must watch me and do as I do. I'll be gay, like this. And he assumed a ghastly grin. And frolicsome. Here he cut a most mournful caper. You'll soon get into it if you keep your eyes on me. They think I'm a funny fellow already, you see. I dare say you 2 thought I was a trifle tipsy last night, but I do assure you it was, well, most of it was put on. I had an idea it would come in useful somehow. The children, when they talked over their adventures afterward, could never feel sure whether this last statement was quite strictly true, but they were sure that Puddleglum thought it was true when he made it. All right, gay's the word, said Scrub. Now, if we could only get someone to open this door. While we're fooling about and being gay, we've got to find out all we can about this castle. Luckily, at that very moment, the door opened, and the giant nurse bustled in, saying, "Now, my poppets like to come and see the king and all the court setting out on the hunting. Such a pretty sight." They lost no time in rushing out past her and climbing down the first staircase they came to. The noise of hounds and horns and giant voices guided them, so that in a few minutes they reached the courtyard. The giants were all on foot, for there are no giant horses in that part of the world, and the giants' hunting is done on foot, like beagling in England. The hounds were also of normal size. When Jill saw that there were no horses, she was at first dreadfully disappointed, for she felt sure that the great fat queen would never go after hounds on foot, and it would never do to have her about the house all day. But then she saw the queen in a kind of litter, supported on the shoulders of 6 young giants. The silly old creature was all got up in green and had a horn at her side. 20 or 30 giants, including the king, were assembled, ready for the sport, all talking and laughing fit to deafen you. And down below, nearer Jill's level, there were wagging tails and barking and loose slobbery mouths and noses of dogs thrust into your hand. Puddleglum was just beginning to strike what he thought a gay and gamesome attitude, which might have spoiled everything if it had been noticed, when Jill put on her most attractively childish smile, rushed across to the queen's litter, and shouted up to the queen, "Oh, please, you're not going away, are you? You will come back." "Yes, my dear," said the queen. "I'll be back tonight." "Oh, good! How lovely!" said Jill. "And we may come to the feast tomorrow night, mayn't we? We're so longing for tomorrow night, and we do love being here. And while you're out, we may run over the whole castle and see everything, mayn't we? Do say yes." The queen did say yes, but the laughter of all the courtiers nearly drowned her voice. Chapter 9. How They Discovered Something Worth Knowing. The others admitted afterward that Jill had been wonderful that day. As soon as the king and the rest of the hunting party had set off, she began making a tour of the whole castle and asking questions, but all in such an innocent, babyish way that no one could suspect her of any secret design. Though her tongue was never still, you could hardly say she talked. She prattled and giggled. She made love to everyone, the grooms, the porters, the housemaids, the ladies-in-waiting, and the elderly giant lords whose hunting days were past. She submitted to being kissed and pawed about by any number of giantesses, many of whom seemed sorry for her, and called her a poor little thing, though none of them explained why. She made especial friends with the cook, and discovered the all-important fact that there was a scullery door which let you out through the outer wall, so that you did not have to cross the courtyard or pass the great gatehouse. In the kitchen she pretended to be greedy, and ate all sorts of scraps which the cook and scullions delighted to give her. But upstairs among the ladies she asked questions about how she would be dressed for the great feast, and how long she would be allowed to sit up, and whether she would dance with some very, very small giant. And then, it made her hot all over when she remembered it afterward, she would put her head on one side in an idiotic fashion which grown-ups, giant and otherwise, thought very fetching, and shake her curls and fidget and say, "Oh, I do wish it was tomorrow night, don't you? Do you think the time will go quickly till then?" And all the giantesses said she was a perfect little darling, and some of them dabbed their eyes with enormous handkerchiefs as if they were going to cry. "They're dear little things at that age," said one giantess to another. "It seems almost a pity." Scrub and Puddleglum both did their best, but girls do that kind of thing better than boys. Even boys do it better than marshwiggles. At lunchtime, something happened which made all 3 of them more anxious than ever to leave the castle of the gentle giants. They had lunch in the great hall at a little table of their own near the fireplace. At a bigger table, about 20 yards away, half a dozen old giants were lunching. Their conversation was so noisy and so high up in the air that the children soon took no more notice of it than you would of hooters outside the window or traffic noises in the street. They were eating cold venison, a kind of food which Jill had never tasted before, and she was liking it. Suddenly Puddleglum turned to them, and his face had gone so pale that you could see the paleness under the natural muddiness of his complexion. He said, "Don't eat another bite." "What's wrong?" said the other 2 in a whisper. "Didn't you hear what those giants were saying?" "That's a nice tender haunch of venison," said one of them. "Then that stag was a liar," said another. "Why?" said the first one. "Oh," said the other, "they say that when he was caught he said, 'Don't kill me, I'm tough, you won't like me.'" For a moment Jill did not realize the full meaning of this, but she did when Scrub's eyes opened wide with horror, and he said, "We've been eating a talking stag." This discovery didn't have exactly the same effect on all of them. Jill, who was new to that world, was very sorry for the poor stag and thought it rotten of the giants to have killed him. Scrub, who had been in that world before and had at least one talking beast as his dear friend, felt horrified, as you might feel about a murder. But Puddleglum, who was Narnian born, was sick and faint, and felt as you would feel if you had found you had eaten a baby. "We've brought the anger of Aslan on us," he said. "That's what comes of not attending to the signs. We're under a curse, I expect. If it was allowed, it would be the best thing we could do to take these knives and drive them into our own hearts." And gradually even Jill came to see it from his point of view. At any rate, none of them wanted any more lunch, and as soon as they thought it was safe, they crept quietly out of the hall. It was now drawing near to that time of the day on which their hopes of escape depended, and all became nervous. They hung about in passages and waited for things to become quiet. The giants in the hall sat on a dreadfully long time after the meal was over. The bald one was telling a story. When that was over, the three travelers dawdled down to the kitchen. But there were still plenty of giants there, or at least in the scullery, washing up and putting things away. It was agonizing waiting till these finished their jobs, and one by one wiped their hands and went away. At last, only one old giantess was left in the room. She pottered about, and at last the three travelers realized with horror that she did not intend to go away at all. "Well, dearie," she said to them, "that job's about through. Let's put the kettle there. That'll make a nice cup of tea presently. Now I can have a little bit of a rest. Just look into the scullery like good poppets and tell me if the back door's open." "Yes, it is," said Scrub. "That's right. I always leave it open so as Puss can get in and out, the poor thing." Then she sat down on one chair and put her feet up on another. "I don't know as I mightn't have 40 winks," said the giantess, "if only that blamey hunting party doesn't coming back too soon." All their spirits leaped up when she mentioned 40 winks, and flopped down again when she mentioned the return of the hunting party. "When do they usually come back?" asked Jill. "You never can tell," said the giantess, "but there, go and be quiet for a bit, my dearies." They retreated to the far end of the kitchen, and would have slipped out into the scullery there and then if the giantess had not sat up, opened her eyes, and brushed away a fly. Don't try it till we're sure she's really asleep," whispered Scrub, "or it'll spoil everything." So they all huddled at the kitchen end, waiting and watching. The thought that the hunters might come back at any moment was terrible, and the giantess was fidgety. Whenever they thought she had really gone to sleep, she moved. "I can't bear this," thought Jill. To distract her mind, she began looking about her. Just in front of her was a clean, wide table with 2 clean pie dishes on it and an open book. They were giant pie dishes, of course. Jill thought she could lie down just comfortably in one of them. Then she climbed up onto the bench beside the table to look at the book. She read, "Mallard. This delicious bird can be cooked in a variety of ways." "It's a cookery book," thought Jill without much interest, and glanced over her shoulder. The giantess's eyes were shut, but she didn't look as if she were properly asleep. Jill glanced back at the book. It was arranged alphabetically, and at the very next entry her heart seemed to stop beating. It ran, "Man. This elegant little biped has long been valued as a delicacy. It forms a traditional part of the autumn feast, and is served between the fish and the joint. Each man—" But she could not bear to read any more. She turned round. The giantess had waked up and was having a fit of coughing. Jill nudged the other two and pointed to the book. They also mounted the bench and bent over the huge pages. Scrub was still reading about how to cook men when Puddleglum pointed to the next entry below it. It was like this: "Marshwiggle. Some authorities reject this animal altogether as unfit for giants' consumption because of its stringy consistency and muddy flavor. The flavor can, however, be greatly reduced if—" Jill touched his feet and Scrub's gently. All three looked back at the giantess. Her mouth was slightly open, and from her nose there came a sound which at that moment was more welcome to them than any music. She snored. And now it was a question of tiptoe work, not daring to go too fast, hardly daring to breathe. Out through the scullery, giant sculleries smell horrid, out at last into the pale sunlight of a winter afternoon. They were at the top of a rough little path which ran steeply down, and, thank heavens, on the right side of the castle. The city ruinous was in sight. In a few minutes they were back on the broad, steep road which led down from the main gate of the castle. They were also in full view from every single window on that side. If it had been 1 or 2 or 5 windows, there'd be a reasonable chance of no one might be looking out. But there were nearer 50 than 5. They now realized, too, that the road on which they were, and indeed all the ground between them and the city ruinous, didn't offer as much cover as would hide a fox. It was all coarse grass and pebbles and flat stones. To make matters worse, they were now in the clothes that the giants had provided for them last night, except Puddleglum, whom nothing would fit. Jill wore a vivid green robe, rather too long for her, and over that a scarlet mantle fringed with white fur. Scrub had scarlet stockings, blue tunic and cloak, a gold-hilted sword, and a feathered bonnet. "Nice bits of color you two are," muttered Puddleglum. "Show up very prettily on a winter day. The worst archer in the world couldn't miss either of you if you were in range. And talking of archers, we'll be sorry not to have our own bows before long, I shouldn't wonder. A bit thin, too, those clothes of yours, are they?" "Yes, I'm freezing already," said Jill. A few minutes ago, when they had been in the kitchen, she had thought that if only they could once get out of the castle, their escape would be almost complete. She now realized that the most dangerous part of it was still to come. "Steady, steady," said Puddleglum. "Don't look back. Don't walk too quickly. Whatever you do, don't run. Look as if we're just taking a stroll, and then if anyone sees us, he might just possibly not bother. The moment we look like people running away, we're done." The distance to the city ruinous seemed longer than Jill would have believed possible, but bit by bit they were covering it. Then came a noise. The other two gasped. Jill, who didn't know what it was, said, "What's that?" "Hunting horn," whispered Scrub. "Don't even run now," said Puddleglum. "Not till I give the word." This time Jill couldn't help glancing over her shoulder. There, about half a mile away, was the hunt returning from behind them on the left. They walked on. Suddenly a great clamor of giant voices arose, then shouts and hollers. "They've seen us! Run!" said Puddleglum. Jill gathered up her long skirts, horrible things for running in, and ran. There was no mistaking the danger now. She could hear the music of the hounds. She could hear the king's voice roaring out, after them, or we'll have no man-pies tomorrow." She was last of the three now, cumbered with her dress, slipping on the loose stones, her hair getting in her mouth, running pains across her chest. The hounds were much nearer. Now she had to run uphill, up the stony slope which led to the lowest step of the giant stairway. She had no idea what they would do when they got there, or how they would be any better off even if they reached the top. But she didn't think about that. She was like a hunted animal now. As long as the pack was after her, she must run till she dropped. The marsh wiggle was ahead. As he came to the lowest step, he stopped, looked a little to his right, and all of a sudden darted into a little hole or crevice at the bottom of it. His long legs, disappearing into it, looked very like those of a spider. Scrub hesitated and then vanished after him. Jill, breathless and reeling, came to the place about a minute later. It was an unattractive hole, a crack between the earth and the stone about 3 feet long and hardly more than a foot high. You had to fling yourself flat on your face and crawl in. You couldn't do it so very quickly either. She felt sure that a dog's teeth would close on her heel before she got inside. "Quick, quick, stones, fill up the opening," came Puddleglum's voice in the darkness beside her. It was pitch black in there, except for the gray light in the opening by which they had crawled in. The other two were working hard. She could see Scrub's small hands and the marsh wiggle's big frog-like hands, black against the light, working desperately to pile up stones. Then she realized how important this was and began groping for large stones herself and handing them to the others. Before the dogs were baying and yelping at the cave mouth, they had it pretty well filled, and now, of course, there was no light at all. "Farther in, quick," said Puddleglum's voice. "Let's all hold hands," said Jill. "Good idea," said Scrub. But it took them quite a long time to find one another's hands in the darkness. The dogs were sniffing at the other side of the barrier now. "Try if we can stand up," suggested Scrub. They did, and found that they could. Then, Puddleglum holding out a hand behind him to Scrub, and Scrub holding a hand out behind him to Jill, who wished very much she was the middle one of the party and not the last, they began groping with their feet and stumbling forward into the blackness. It was all loose stones underfoot. Then Puddleglum came up to a wall of rock. They turned a little to their right and went on. There were a good many more twists and turns. Jill had now no sense of direction at all and no idea where the mouth of the cave lay. "The question is," came Puddleglum's voice out of the darkness ahead, "whether, taking one thing with another, it wouldn't be better to go back, if we can, and give the giants a treat at the feast of theirs, instead of losing our way in the guts of a hill, where 10 to 1 there's dragons and deep holes and gases and water and— Ow! Let go! Save yourselves! After that, all happened quickly. There was a wild cry, a swishing, dusty, gravelly noise, a rattle of stones, and Jill found herself sliding, hopelessly sliding, and sliding quicker every moment, down a slope that grew steeper every moment. It was not a smooth, firm slope, but a slope of small stones and rubbish. Even if you could have stood up, it would have been no use. Any bit of the slope you had put your foot on would have slid away from under you and carried you down with it. But Jill was more lying than standing, and the farther they all slid, the more they disturbed all the stones and earth, so that the general downward rush of everything, including themselves, got faster and louder and dustier and dirtier. From the sharp cries and swearing of the other two, Jill got the idea that many of the stones she was dislodging were hitting Scrub and Puddleglum pretty hard, and now she was going at a furious rate and felt sure she would be broken to bits at the bottom. Yet somehow they weren't. They were a mass of bruises, and the wet, sticky stuff on her face appeared to be blood. And such a mass of loose earth, shingle, and larger stones was piled up around her and partly over her that she couldn't get up. The darkness was so complete that it made no difference at all whether you had your eyes open or shut. There was no noise. And that was the very worst moment Jill had ever known in her life. Supposing she was alone, supposing the others. Then she heard movements around her, and presently all three, in shaken voices, were explaining that none of them seemed to have any broken bones. "We can never get up that again," said Scrubb's voice. "And have you noticed how warm it is?" said the voice of Puddleglum. "That means we're a long way down, might be nearly a mile." No one said anything. Some time later Puddleglum added, "My tinderbox has gone." After another long pause, Jill said, "I'm terribly thirsty." No one suggested doing anything. There was so obviously nothing to be done. For the moment, they did not feel it quite so badly as one might have expected. That was because they were so tired. Long afterward, without the slightest warning, an utterly strange voice spoke. They knew at once that it was not the one voice in the whole world for which each had secretly been hoping, the voice of Aslan. It was a dark, flat voice, almost, if you know what that means, a pitch-black voice. It said, "What make you here, creatures of the overworld?"
The story continues with chapters 10 through 12 in the next recording.